Okay, good afternoon. I'm David Myers, and my job is to welcome you to the third and final presentation of the Salt of the Earth School for Radical Education this spring. The purpose of our school is to provide classes to educate people about how radical organizations and labor movements have made significant contributions to hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people to make their lives better. Our goal is to establish a permanent venue to continue presenting these classes. Um, we will begin a new set of classes in the fall, and we hope to be able to present them in person. So please check our webpage on a regular basis for updates. And now I'll turn this part of the program over to the person who is monitoring and facilitating today's presentation, to Lucy. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Lucy. Today we have a presentation by Dr. Ken Hammond, which is really exciting. I'm really excited to see a presentation by him. Dr. Hammond he's a professor at New Mexico State University. I believe he got his PhD from Harvard, so that's pretty cool. He lived in China for 5 years, and he's been teaching at New Mexico State since 1994, and he's currently working with Pivot to Peace. So he's doing all kinds of stuff, and he's going to teach you all kinds of stuff.
Okay, are we ready to go? All right, good deal. Oh, well, good afternoon there, comrades. Always glad to have some time to chat with people about China. And you probably all are aware that this year, 2021, will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. So as part of this radical education project, we thought it would be a good opportunity, a good moment to devote some attention to the history of the party in China, the history of the Chinese Revolution. And so that's pretty much what I want to do today. So what I'm going to do is stick up some PowerPoint slides here, if I can get those. There we go. And just take us through, obviously we can't do each and every event or development in the course of this, but we'll hit as many of the highlights as we can along the way. The little Chinese phrase at the bottom of this slide is one that is very common. You hear it, it's a song in China, you hear it in various contexts. It says, 没有共产党就没有新中国, which means without the Communist Party, there would be no new China. And this is the basic lesson, the basic message that I think we want to try to understand, that the Communist Party of China has been the force which over the last 100 years has worked to bring the Chinese people out of the conditions of oppression and division and poverty that they faced at the hands of Western imperialism and domestic reactionary governments into the era of the new China, and has then guided the process of political and social and economic development in the 71 plus years since the establishment of the People's Republic. So this idea that without the Communist Party there'd be no new China, just keep that in mind. That's sort of the animating principle or narrative foundation of what we're going to talk about today. So how did there come to be a Communist Party in China? Why is that something that happened in 1921? There's a lot of history is one of those things where every time you start working on a particular question, you find out you need to go back a little earlier and a little earlier and a little earlier, and it becomes a process of kind of infinite regression. But we're not going to go too far back today. In the 19-teens, China was in a state of tremendous upheaval and turmoil. In 1911, there'd been the revolution that overthrew the imperial system. China had had an imperial government going back for more than 2,000 years. The current dynasty at that time, what was called the Qing dynasty, had been in power since 1644. But in facing the challenges of Western imperialism that began to assault China early in the 19th century, And in coping with the changes taking place within China itself, the imperial system had proven to be unworkable, unsustainable. It served the interests of tiny elites that didn't really care about the fate of the mass of the people of China. And it was subordinate in many ways to the manipulations of the Western powers. So in 1911, the Chinese people in various ways rose up and did away with the imperial system. They tried for a while in China to replace that with a republic, the Republic of China, the remnants of which are still with us today on the island of Taiwan. But that did not prove to be an overwhelmingly successful endeavor. China was still vulnerable not only to the Western powers, but now to the rising attentions of Imperial Japan. And China faced a lot of deep challenges within its own boundaries, within its own society as well. One of the things that had happened in the course of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, was that many Chinese had begun to question the viability, the utility of their traditional culture. And in fact, in the 19-teens, there was a phenomenon called the New Culture Movement, which was aimed to criticize those things in Chinese tradition that kind of held the country back, held the people back, and to call for new developments, new changes, looking in a new direction. This took the form of various publications and organizations. The image on the right here is a magazine that used to be published at that time called New Youth, Xin Qingyan, New Youth. And this was an effort to sort of regenerate Chinese society from within. In 1917, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution took place right next door in Russia. The Tsarist Empire was overthrown. The Bolsheviks came to power in October of 1917 and set about the task of creating a socialist Soviet system within Russia, within the territory of the old Tsarist Empire. They also hoped to spark revolutions in other parts of the world. And indeed, at the end of World War I, there were revolutionary outbreaks in Europe, but unfortunately, those were not successful. Those were put down by reactionary forces. And the Bolsheviks wound up having to make their way in a challenging world in an effort to as they put it, build socialism in one country. But the establishment of the Soviet Union, the success, the victory of the Bolshevik Revolution became an inspiration for people all over the world, but especially in the colonial and semi-colonial countries, who were looking for ways to liberate their countries, to bring their people into the modern world, and to find a way to rid themselves of the burden of exploitation and oppression by the Western powers. In 1919, at the end of the First World War, the victorious Allies had gathered together in Versailles in France to hammer out a peace treaty that they would see as the foundation of a new world order. But in that treaty, they completely ignored the wishes and the aspirations of the subject peoples in the colonial empires of the European powers. There had been hope because of the rhetoric of self-determination that was mouthed by bourgeois politicians in the West, that after the First World War, subject peoples would be granted greater autonomy, greater self-government, a greater role in the governance of their own countries. But that didn't happen. One particularly egregious example of that was that the Allies handed over the former German territorial concessions in China, not to China. They didn't return them to China, but they gave them to the Japanese. So they replaced one imperialist exploiter with another. And when news of this arrived in China on May 4th, 1919, it triggered huge demonstrations fighting against the forces of the government that were seen as selling out the people, boycotts against Japanese goods. It became a national movement of liberation, of struggle against colonialism, against imperialism from the West. In that context of the new culture movement, the Bolshevik Revolution, the frustration that many young Chinese felt with the Western powers, the so-called liberal democratic powers, who had totally betrayed the needs and interests of colonial and semi-colonial people. The interest in Marxism and socialism developed quite rapidly in China. And a lot of reading groups sprang up around the country, people reading the works of Marx and Engels, people reading Lenin's writings, and other theoretical and practical works relating to the ideas of socialism and communism. A number of important Chinese intellectuals, men like Chen Duxiu, Li Dajiao, Cai Yuanpei, a few others, gathered groups around themselves in different cities, in Beijing, in Shanghai, and in other parts of the country as well. And by the beginning of the 1920s, there was a significant group of educated young people who were aspiring to do something to get their country onto a path that would allow it to become self-sufficient, self-sustaining, strong enough to stand up to the Western powers and to make a new future for itself in the modern world. Well, that took one specific form. There were a number of groups, a number of sets of people who had hopes for coming together and making some kind of change. But for our purposes, the most important one, of course, was what would become the Chinese Communist Party. And many of the people who were involved in these reading groups, wanted to get together and have a functional organization, a mechanism that would allow them to agitate and organize and do the kind of work that was necessary to build a revolutionary movement. They received assistance from what we call the Third International, which was, it's also sometimes called, you'll hear it referred to as the Communist International. This was an organization based in Moscow that was established after the Bolshevik Revolution in order to aid and facilitate revolutionary movements in many, many parts of the world. The Bolsheviks understood that for socialism and communism to become true realities, it would be the best path forward would be world revolution, revolution in the most advanced countries where capitalism was most highly developed, but also revolutions in the colonial countries that would overthrow imperialism and try to fight against the contradictions of that system. So the Third International sent out agents to countries in many parts of the world, including China, to offer advice and material assistance to local socialists and communists who wanted to organize their own parties. And in July of 1921, in Shanghai, in the little building that's pictured here in the slide, a small group, only 12 delegates, gathered together to hold what they called the First Party Congress, the first Congress of the Communist Party of China. These were, of course, these 12 delegates didn't represent everyone who was interested in this. These were the people who were able to get to Shanghai and take part in this particular meeting. But at that time, in July of 21, there were probably only maybe 600 or 700 people who would have identified themselves as members of the party at that point. It was a small grouping, but it had a lot of potential. There was a separate founding about the same time in Paris, France, of the Communist Party of China, because a lot of young Chinese had gone to France during World War I to work in factories to replace French workers who had been sent off to die in the trenches. Many of them had stayed on. They had become exposed to socialist and communist ideas in the factories of France. Two in particular that you may have heard of, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, were founding members of the Communist Party of China in Paris. So there's the First Party Congress was held here in Shanghai, but there's also a separate group that gets started there in Paris as well. So that's the establishment of the party. That's the anniversary that will be marked this summer with big celebrations in China to commemorate this launching of this great enterprise. There were theoretical questions as well as, of course, very practical questions about how to go forward, about how to proceed. Okay, it's one thing, we found the Communist Party, we have a party now. What should that party be doing? What sort of political organizing, what sort of revolutionary activities should that party undertake? And this is a complex theoretical question, or it was a complex theoretical question at the time, because of the state of development of the Chinese economy. China was a country of perhaps 500 million people at this time, and the industrial economy, the modern industrial sector of the economy, was very small. There were perhaps a few million workers in factories in different parts of China, but this is a very small industrial proletariat. Classical Marxist theory, of course, emphasized the idea that it would be the proletariat, the industrial working class, which would be the vanguard of the revolution, would be the force which would transform social and economic and political life, which would recreate the world in its own image, which would make would launch the process of socialist transformation. But there was very little proletariat in China. So what should one do? How should the party behave? The International advised the communists that they should join forces with what was called the Kuomintang, the nationalist party, led by a fellow named Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was a revolutionary. He had been one of the leaders of the overthrow of the imperial system back in 1911. He was the leader of the Nationalist Party, this Kuomintang party. He had some sympathies, some leanings towards socialism. Many of his writings can be read as advocating socialist ideas and principles. He was not a communist. He didn't affiliate with the Communist Party, but instead was open to also having advice from the International. The International saw nationalist movements in various countries as necessary allies, necessary forces to work with in trying to fight against imperialism. So the advice of the International, both to the Communist Party and to the Kuomintang, was to form a united front, to work together. And this was agreed to, and from 1923 to 1927, period we call the First United Front, members of the Communist Party joined the Nationalist Party. But they didn't just be absorbed into it. They maintained their own party identity as communists, and they retained a certain autonomy of function within the Nationalist Party. But many people from the Communist Party became important activists, even leaders within the Nationalist Party during this period, including Mao Zedong, who is shown in this drawing here on the slide. Who worked in what was called the Peasant Bureau, the bureau within the Nationalist Party that oversaw the formation, the guidance of farmers' unions, basically in the countryside. It was also during the period of the First United Front that the Whampoa Military Academy was established, which was designed to train military forces for the United Front, for the nationalists, and to some extent for the communists. A lot of communist activists went through the training at the military academy. Well, this First United Front lasted about 4 years until 1927, at which point, by that time, Sun Yat-sen had died. He passed away in 1924, and a new leader takes over the Nationalist Party, and this is Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek was a rabid anti-communist. He was opposed to communism ideologically. He saw it as just a negative force. He was also very closely involved with the national capitalist groups within China. That is to say, those elements of the bourgeoisie who were opposed to imperialism because they wanted to get a bigger slice of the economic pie, a bigger share of the profits for themselves. They were nationalists. They were opposed to European and Japanese domination, but they were not revolutionaries in the sense of wanting to create a new socialist society. In the winter of 26 to 27, Chiang Kai-shek, using soldiers trained at the military academy, launches what's called the Northern Expedition, which was literally a march from the nationalist base, which was in the far south in Guangzhou, or sometimes you know it as Canton, near where modern Hong Kong is. And they fought their way north. They took over the central part of China. They subordinated some of the local warlords who had been running their little parts of the country for about 10 years. And then they turned east and went down the course of the Yangtze River towards Shanghai. Now, Shanghai was the most industrialized city in China. It was the great port. The docks were full of workers. And the Communist Party had built its strongest units, its strongest movements in Shanghai, in the factories, trade unions, all different kinds of workers. And they were, of course, part of this united front with the nationalists. So as the nationalist forces approached Shanghai in April of 1927, the communists within the city launched an uprising to sort of take power, so the nationalist forces wouldn't have to fight their way into the city. But at this point, Chiang Kai-shek, who, as I say, was pretty anti-communist, stopped. He waited outside of Shanghai, and he secretly allied himself with the criminal gangs, the organized crime groups within the city, so that a counter-revolutionary strike against the Communist Party and against the communist workers and unions took place. And there was a kind of a mini civil war in Shanghai. Thousands of communist activists were killed. Many thousands more were put in jail. It really decimated the party at that point. The nationalists then came in and took over and incorporated Shanghai into the new republic that they were trying to put together. But this put the communists in a very difficult position. And for about the next 7 years, they really struggled. They worked hard to try to figure out how to go forward. What should be the line in China? This idea of a united front, while there were certain theoretical attractions that it had, it certainly didn't work out well in the end because of the political realities of Chiang Kai-shek and the national bourgeoisie and things like that. This struggle for a new line in China kind of unfortunately coincided with the conflicts that were taking place within the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of Lenin's death, there were contentious goings on within the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party. And in particular, of course, the antithesis between Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin and Trotsky had very different views of how the revolution should go forward. We don't need to go into those in deep detail here. That would be a fun thing to do at leisure at some other time. But the question of how things should go forward in China was a matter that became a subject of debate between Stalin and Trotsky and within the International. And so it took a long time for things to get resolved. There were those who simply wanted to hold on to the idea that only the revolutionary industrial proletariat could lead a communist movement. And so you had to stay in the cities and try to rebuild the factory unions and things like that. But there were others who argued for more flexibility, that a turn to a more popular appeal might provide a new basis for revolutionary activity. And again, Mao Zedong was one of the advocates of this alternative position. His work with the farmers' unions in central China, in Hunan province, which was his native province, had convinced him that the farmers in China, the peasants in China, should be understood not purely or not classically as a petty bourgeois strata, that is to say, a kind of middling strata between the workers and the bourgeoisie, a strata that could sort of flop either way depending on particular circumstances, but that in China, the farmers, the peasants, constituted what Mao called an agricultural proletariat. that there were so many tenant farmers, farmers who didn't own their own land, who had to sell their labor power to landlords, small farmers who simply had enough land to eke out a subsistence existence for their own families. And then maybe a few larger peasant owners who had enough land to support themselves and make a little bit of a profit, maybe even hire just a few hands to assist them. And then there were the landlords, the great landlords who controlled so much of the productive property in the countryside. So Mao viewed the peasants as a potentially revolutionary force, both in their own right, but especially as allies of the urban proletariat. And he saw a path forward which would rely upon the peasantry. But it took a long time for these debates within the party to be resolved. Early on, 1927, 1928, the party leadership, still being advised by the International and still basically going along with the emphasis on the urban proletariat, urged the farmers, the peasant forces in central China, to launch a couple of uprisings to try to seize the capital cities of inland provinces. These are known as the Autumn Harvest and the Nanchang uprisings. And both of these were failures. They were not strong enough. They didn't have the capacity. They didn't have the support in these towns to establish revolutionary governments. And as a result of that, these were further setbacks. More comrades were lost. More organizations were disrupted. It was a very, it was further damage was inflicted on the viability of the party. It did lead, and we'll talk about this more in just a moment, it did lead to the creation of what's called the Jiangxi Soviet. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. But it also ushered in a period, the people who had been the advocates of these uprisings kind of lost their positions as party leaders. A gentleman named Li San comes into power in the late 20s, and he becomes the main party leader going into the early 1930s. There's also a group of young communists who we call the 28 Bolsheviks, who had been sent to Russia to study. They studied at the Political Institute in Moscow, and then they were sent back to take over the leadership, take over leading positions within the party. But they too were strongly influenced by what by this time had come to be Stalin's dominance in the Soviet Union. And so they were still pushing this original line of relying on the urban proletariat for revolutionary struggle. So the party had still not come up with a new approach that might give it greater success in building the revolutionary movement. That comes largely from the creation of the rural base areas, what are called the revolutionary base areas. And the Jiangxi Soviet is the largest and most important of these. After the failure of the rebellions in the late 20s, the remnants of those uprisings, the military forces that withdrew from those uprisings, went up into the mountains. Particularly, Jiangxi is a province in sort of south central China, and around the southern rim of that province are some pretty rugged mountains, and that's where the military forces withdrew to. And that led to the founding of the Red Army. Zhu De was the founder of that and remained its senior figure all the way down until his death in 1976. But the Red Army and the base area in Jiangxi became the foundation of what they called the Jiangxi Soviet, an attempt to build a revolutionary government in this somewhat remote region of China. Now, it's up in the mountains. I say it's a somewhat remote region, and that's certainly true, but it's still China, which is a very densely populated place. So this was the Jiangxi Soviet had a population of over 10 million people. So, you know, you don't want to think of this as just a few folks scattered off around a campfire in the mountains. This was a significant population, and it became a kind of laboratory within which the party could experiment a bit with its policies, with how to work towards creating an egalitarian, just society that could serve as a foundation for building socialism. Mao carried out a lot of research at this time, wrote a very important book called An Analysis of the Classes in Chinese Society. And the party experimented with programs of land reform, how to redistribute land in ways that would empower the poorer peasants without completely alienating and driving off support from richer peasants, wealthier peasants, and even small landlords. They experimented with a marriage law to try to advance equality, gender equality between men and women. Again, trying to find a way to bring progressive modern reforms into a social context in which a lot of ordinary people still had somewhat conservative views. So they were trying to navigate their way politically in a very complex situation. But the Jiangxi Soviet flourished for a few years, the early 1930s, and the party was able to build its strength and achieve significant success. It was not the only base area, not the only Soviet. It was the largest and the one where the most important leaders had gathered. But it also became the target of what the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek called bandit extermination campaigns. They wanted to wipe out the communists. Now this, on the map here, you can see, this is the Jiangxi Soviet area down in the southern part of the country. There were other Soviet base areas, as you can see, but some of them, you see these ones with the X's through them, these had been overrun or captured by the nationalists. And the nationalists were, by 1934, they had carried out a series of what they called encirclement campaigns around the Jiangxi Soviet, tighter and tighter grasp of that area to try to wipe out the communist forces there. So in the fall of 1934, the leadership decided that they needed to make a break for it. Some comrades decided to remain and launch an offensive in one area which would draw the nationalist forces away, while the main force of the communists and the Red Army took off in the opposite direction. And this becomes just an epic moment in China's revolutionary history, what we call the Long March. 120,000 people broke out of the base area on October 16th, 1934. And over the next year, they walked literally over 2,500 miles. You can see the course here on the map, first to the west, then north, and then finally looping over to a place called Yan'an. Now that's this area up here in the far northwest. It's a high desert plateau, kind of a very dry, rough area, but large enough again, and with a sufficient local population to serve as a base for revolutionary development. Only 18,000 of the original 120,000 made it to Yan'an. Some died along the way, some dropped out because of exhaustion or just couldn't take it. It was a very, very difficult enterprise and a kind of epic struggle to get there. Not long after they had started, in January of 1935, when they were still down in the southwest, they stopped at a town called Zunyi and held a party conference. And by this time, the leadership within the party was increasingly convinced that Mao's ideas about relying on the peasantry were the correct line, were the better approach. And so as they discussed the situation, they decided that they would invite the chairman to be the chairman. They would invite Mao Zedong, who hadn't been chairman up to this point, but they would invite Mao Zedong to become chairman. That's him kind of leaning inside the doorway here, the fellow with his arms crossed. This is Zhou Enlai, who was always sort of Chairman Mao's right-hand man. Party leaders initially offered him the chairmanship at the Zunyi conference, but he deferred to Mao. He saw Mao as the more visionary leader, while he himself had skills that would probably be more useful as his kind of, as I say, as basically his right-hand man. Well, once the Long March reaches Yan'an, the leadership settles in there. The party, it becomes the center, not the only location, but the center of party activism for the next 7 or 8 years. And this was a period where the party went through some very important internal work, but also, of course, faced great external challenges as well. The Yan'an period, especially the first 4 or 5 years of the Yan'an period, was a period of what we call party rectification, which is to say that the mission of the Communist Party, the goal of communist revolution, of overthrowing the old forces in society and building a new China, building a new socialist, modern, industrial society, needed to be understood. Everyone needed to be on board. They had to understand both the theoretical principles and arguments of Marxism and Leninism, and they needed practical tasks, practical programs, applications of those theoretical ideals in order to be able to make the revolution into a reality. This was a period when the party debated. The Communist Party was a democratic centralist organization, so they debated a lot of these issues, and they made decisions. And those decisions, of course, became binding on the membership. They could be reopened and debated at later times if experience suggested that would be a good thing. But the party determined certain policies, certain orientations, certain practices, and the party rectification campaigns were basically movements to ensure that everybody understood those, everybody was on board, everybody was, singing from the same songbook, basically. The Yan'an period was also a time when Mao did his most serious theoretical work, his essays on practice and on contradiction, and the series of talks that he gave on art and literature, which would become very important later during the period of the Cultural Revolution. The Yan'an period also allowed the party to carry out further policy experiments, further refine especially their work in the area of land reform. But of course, all through this period as well, the party and the revolution was facing the invasion of China by Japan. That breaks out in the summer of 1937, and much of China is occupied by Japan down until 1945. This gave rise to what we call the Second United Front, because from January of 37 on, the nationalists and the communists, not without some continuing friction, but they decided to work together to resist Japanese imperialism, to resist the Japanese invasion. The communists basically ran a guerrilla war in North China. The nationalists held positions in the South and engaged in some more main force battles with the Japanese. Both sides, fought against the Japanese. We don't want to belittle the contributions of nationalist fighters, but Chiang Kai-shek also held on to a lot of the military assistance that he received from the United States, because his plan was to basically let the Americans defeat Japan and then use the resources he had built up to fight against the communists. Well, as we know, in August of 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States after it was bombed with the 2 atomic bombs, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In China, that led to a period through the fall of 45 through much of 1946 of negotiations, sponsored in part by the United States, but negotiations between the nationalists and the communists to try to see if they could put together some sort of a coalition government that would allow both parties to participate, perhaps trying to carry on this principle of the United Front. That didn't work out so well. And by 1947, civil war between the two parties was well underway. The nationalists, who were, they lacked mass support. They were seen as having sort of rested on their laurels during much of the Second World War. They were associated, as I mentioned earlier, with organized crime groups. They were seen as corrupt. They didn't pay their soldiers particularly either very well or very frequently. Nationalist forces didn't want to fight against other patriotic Chinese. And so the nationalist military kind of fell apart. And by the winter of 1948 to 49, they were pretty much in full retreat. As far as the party goes, the main development during this period was the theory of the new democratic revolution. And this, again, Mao Zedong enunciated this in a series of writings. And this was the idea that after liberation, and it was clear that the communists were going to win the Civil War, after liberation, they would not seek to immediately create a fully socialized economy, but instead would pursue a period that they called the new democracy, where they would work with other parties, with other individuals within the country to find the best way to stabilize China, modernize China, make China into a society that was not run for the interests of an elite, but run rather for the interests of the masses of the people. Liberation, of course, comes step by step in 1949, and that reaches its fullest expression, perhaps, on October 1st, with the proclamation of the People's Republic. Chairman Mao very famously, from the rostrum at Tiananmen, says that the Chinese people have stood up. Founding the People's Republic is a great achievement, but the challenges that lay ahead for the party were significant. Very quickly, an alliance with the Soviet Union was concluded, and that was very important because Soviet advisors and Soviet assistants helped get the process of building socialism started in the 1950s. But the biggest challenge for the party itself was, having enough capability to undertake the tasks that were necessary to administer the country and oversee the process of socialist transformation. And this required the significant expansion in the size of the party. In 49, at the time of liberation, there were perhaps 1 million members of the Communist Party, many of whom were not fully literate, many of whom came from rural villages and didn't really know a lot about running an urban society. And so the party welcomed new members. And by 1959, there were 10 million members. Now, many of the people who joined the party in the 50s were sincere. They were patriots. They believed in the new China. They wanted to contribute however they might. But other people joined the party because they saw it as maybe a source of security for themselves. They saw it as an opportunity to build their careers, basically for reasons that we would call opportunistic. They didn't necessarily have a deep commitment to the ideals of socialism, or even perhaps an understanding of the principles of Marxism. And so a lot of people who came into the party may have had at best mixed motivations and mixed consciousness. Nonetheless, the party was able to undertake great initiatives. Probably the two most important was the oversight of land reform, the redistribution of land, taking land away from the wealthy landowners who controlled big estates and distributing it to either landless peasants or farmers who simply didn't have enough to do more than sustain themselves, but now could pursue a better livelihood. Land reform was critical. It broke the final remnants of the old power of the imperial elite, and it created the foundation for agricultural cooperativization and collectivization, which would yield the surplus that could be used, could be devoted to industrial development. So industrialization is the other great undertaking. And again, in this period of new democracy, it wasn't just proclaiming that this factory now belongs to the government. It was working in tandem with capitalist elements, national patriotic bourgeois elements within the country to keep those factories running and to start to invest and modernize in moving them towards a socialist takeover. But this wasn't something that was just done by fiat on the day after liberation. Nonetheless, in the course of the 50s, what we call the struggle between two lines began to emerge within the party. And there's a number of elements that are involved in this. At the core of this is the problem of bureaucratization, which is to say that once the party was in power, and especially once millions of new party members came in, many of whom certainly may have had, as I say, career ambitions or attitudes that were a little more self-serving. Bureaucracies in general have a tendency to become self-protective, self-perpetuating, and a tendency to sometimes view the people who they are meant to serve as people who should simply do what they're told, and that can be a problem. Mao, during the 50s, did an extensive critique of what he saw as the problems of bureaucratization within the Soviet economy. He really saw the Soviets as having drifted into a kind of top-down commandism, which he was opposed to. There were also debates within the party over the question of Reds versus experts. Should you be red or should you be expert? The idea being that the people leaning towards the red position were the ones like Chairman Mao, who believed in sort of mass mobilization, unleashing the creative force of popular energy. But the expert people felt that building socialism, developing the economy was a challenging task that needed people with highly developed skills and talents, with education, with technical competence, and they should be relied upon as sort of the guiding and driving force. These were different perspectives on the developmental process. Agricultural collectivization proceeded, military modernization proceeded. By the end of the 50s, China attempted a great socialist takeoff, what was called the Great Leap Forward. The little poster image here sort of shows a vision of this, where the economy would be a fusion of industry and agriculture. There would be farming, there would be all the functions of local life in the countryside, but there would also be, as you can see here, small factories, small production facilities. This was a vision that, of course, goes back to the 10-point program in the Communist Manifesto. This idea of breaking down the division between the urban and the rural, and creating a socialist system that was balanced between those two functions. The Great Leap Forward ran into problems, many of which were the result of the very bureaucratization that Mao was worried about. The false reporting of production statistics, which became increasingly inflated as they moved up the hierarchy. Problems with planning for the future because they were based upon these faulty statistical models. Excessive extraction of grain from the countryside, which meant that many, many people in the countryside went hungry. There were deep social problems, deep economic contradictions at this point. And in 1959, at a place called Lushan, a plenum meeting, a meeting of the leadership of the party, brought this struggle between two lines very much out into the open. And as a result of that, a kind of compromise was reached. One of the leaders of the sort of expert side, a military man named Peng Dehuai, was removed as defense minister, but Chairman Mao also was forced to step back from day-to-day leadership within the party and sort of become a kind of elder statesman. He found that very frustrating, and during the 60s, during the early 60s, he struggled to maintain a positive role within the party. There was something called the socialist education movement. There was the retrenchment that followed the Great Leap, where a lot of the rolling back of some of the gains that had been made in the 50s was put into practice. And in 1965, the chairman got involved in some debates and disputes over cultural issues. We don't need to go into the details of that. Again, we could spend a whole few hours just doing the Cultural Revolution. But as a result of these continuing conflicts, the unresolved nature of this struggle between two lines, by the spring of 1966, Mao and his supporters wanted to launch what they called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And they proclaimed the desirability of, as they put it, attacking the headquarters. By the fall of 66, Red Guards had been mobilized, big character posters, public posters, criticizing the leaders of the party, criticizing the bureaucratization of the party, calling for direct mass supervision of the party. This was a deep, deep crisis for the party. By February of 67, this crisis reached its most intense expression with the formation of what's called the Shanghai Commune. This was a period, it was less than a full month, but it was a period where the workers, 2 million workers in mass organizations in Shanghai, basically set aside the local party committee, the local party leadership, and established instead a directly elected commune based on the workers' mass organizations. This was an emulation of their understanding of the revolutionary experiments of the Paris Commune back in 1871. But it became a crunch point for the party. And Chairman Mao himself intervened in Shanghai to suggest that you couldn't really set aside the role of the party, that the revolution needed leadership. He talked about how, the revolution, the body of the revolution, it needed a head, and the party was the head. And it was necessary to radicalize and reinvigorate the party, but you couldn't just set the party aside. And so the commune dissolved itself and instead set up the first of what became a national pattern of what were called 3-in-1 committees: the party, the army, and the masses of workers. And this was the form of leadership that persisted for a couple of years in the late 1960s until the Ninth Party Congress in April of 1969, when a new central committee was elected, a new leadership was put in place, and the Cultural Revolution effectively, as a mass movement, comes to an end after that point. There were still struggles within the party all through the 70s down till 1976. But the idea of subjecting the party to direct mass supervision faded away by the time of the Ninth Party Congress. These struggles within the party in the mid up to the mid 70s were more ideological in nature. They were important and they're worth looking at in their own right, but they remained confined. They were intra-party conflicts rather than a struggle involving the party and the masses. Okay. Well, in 1976 was a dramatic turning point. Zhou Enlai died in January, Zhu De died in July, and Chairman Mao died in September. It was a lot of the old leaders, the more radical revolutionary leaders, left the scene. And Deng Xiaoping, who had been a founder of the party in Paris all the way back in 1921 and a lifetime revolutionary communist, but who had been more inclined to the expert side of the struggle between two lines and therefore had been marginalized during the Cultural Revolution, reemerged by 1978, by the very end of 1978, as a new leader. And he, reorients the direction in which the party was going to advance. Many people in China by that time felt kind of politically exhausted by the mass campaigns of the 60s and the early 70s. And so those were the new leadership, Deng Xiaoping and his supporters, made it clear that they would set those aside. There would be no more of these mass campaigns. There was also the reversal of verdicts. People who had been condemned as rightists or anti-party elements, many of them were brought back inside the party so that they could resume contributing to the party's mission. Hopefully, they had had some time to think about their situation, but now they were going to be brought back into the party. And a commission was set up, which over the next few years produced a judgment published in 1982 under the title On Certain Issues in the History of Our Party, which assessed the historical experience of the party since liberation, and particularly the role of Chairman Mao. And this very famously stipulated that he was a great revolutionary who had made major contributions, and without whose actions, the revolution could not have succeeded, but that he had also made serious mistakes. There's still debate, there's still a range of opinion in China in general, and probably even within the party, over the position of Chairman Mao. Certainly the present leadership under Xi Jinping has evoked his legacy more strongly than had been the case for a while. But at this point, in the turning point of the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, Chairman Mao was judged to have made a lot of good contributions, but also some serious mistakes. The key thing, the most important thing that goes on with Deng Xiaoping and the turn to the reform era is the decision to use market mechanisms to develop the productive economy. Okay, this is still the path that China is on today, and the idea was that as Marx himself said, markets had been the great driving force of economic development and the rise of the bourgeoisie. In the manifesto, he spends a lot of time talking about the great dramatic role of capital in building the modern economy. There's also the precedent of the new economic policies in early 1920s Russia that Lenin put in place, allowing capitalists to conduct their economic activities to try to jumpstart the economy so you'd have a base for building socialism. So this was the decision that was made by Deng and the party leadership at the turn of the 70s to the 80s, to use market mechanisms to develop the productive economy. And that included opening the country to foreign direct investment, to capital coming into China, and the creation of what were called the special economic zones, which is where these kinds of modern productive activities could be pursued. And those policies were implemented through the 1980s, but they generated contradictions within China, some serious contradictions, problems of corruption, of inequality. There were debates within the party over how much reform, how fast should reform be pursued, and how much of the socialist core should be retained. Figures like Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, who's the fellow with the speaker thing here, bullhorn here, they wanted to push further and further along a path which, quite frankly, probably would have put China on, as they say, the capitalist road in a much more serious way. Social concerns arose during this period, the effects of the one-child policy, exposure to the outside world generated some interesting sort of youth cultural issues. Unemployment and restructuring, even within the state-owned enterprises, created social contradictions. In April, May of '89, as I'm sure you all know, there were big protests, big demonstrations in Beijing. Students and other young people occupied Tiananmen Square, set up a kind of tent city there. Initially, these protests were probably patriotic, probably people wanting to have a greater voice, wanting to have a greater opportunity for participation in political decision-making. But they came to be manipulated by anti-party elements, and especially by the international media. I remember at the time watching Dan Rather on CBS News gleefully predicting the fall of the Communist Party and that a regime change was about to take place. By the end of May, the hardliners amongst the protesters who wanted to provoke violent confrontation in the hopes of bringing down the party and the government had become dominant. and the contradiction simply could not be resolved. So, as we all know, June 4th, 1989, the People's Liberation Army had to come into Beijing. There was fighting in the streets. Hundreds of people, 600 to 800 people probably were killed. Quite a number of whom were soldiers who were killed by anti-party forces. But the party reestablished control, the government reestablished control, and the program of reform was resumed. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping traveled around the South to look at modernizing experiments and rededicated the party to the path of reform and using markets to develop the economy. Since then, China's remained basically on that path, and the party has remained dedicated to those objectives. Jiang Zemin, who's on the upper left here, and Hu Jintao on the right, these were the leaders of the party in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century. They oversaw practices such as allowing capitalists to join the party. I remember at the time thinking this was a really weird thing, but the idea, the theory is, you should pardon the expression, it's better to have them inside pissing out than outside pissing in. If they're in the party, they're subject to party discipline. They are going to be part of the conversation, which was a necessary consideration. China also joined the World Trade Organization, embracing becoming connected to the international global capitalist system. But again, this is a matter of, as Marx says, people make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. They have to deal with the conditions in which they find themselves. To develop China, to modernize China, to establish a base for building socialism, participating in the global capitalist economy was a necessary engagement, so long as the party remained the guiding force. This was also the period, the 90s and the 2000s, the early 2000s, of keeping a low profile internationally, of emphasizing what they called the peaceful rise, emphasizing the idea that China wasn't going to bother anybody. They just wanted to go about their own business in modernizing the country. Well, that brings us to the present. And of course, the fellow here, this is Xi Jinping. He is the leader of the Communist Party today. He also remains dedicated to this goal of using markets to develop the economy, to create the base for achieving at least the initial stages of socialism. He has been not as low profile, not as low key as Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, because China now is confident. China now has reached a point where it is better able to chart its own path. Xi Jinping and his cohort in the leadership have pursued anti-corruption campaigns to reestablish discipline within the party and within the government. He has revived the overt Marxist quality of the party, emphasized Marxist studies within the party and in society, reactivated party units within enterprises. These had kind of fallen into a more passive role. He wants the party to play an active role wherever it is. Remember that there are now 92 million members of the Communist Party. 1 out of every 7 adults in China is a member of the Communist Party. Most particularly, he's been very clear in emphasizing the leadership role that the party has over private capital. There is private capital. There are private capitalists in China. Very recently, we've seen the party come down hard on one of the biggest of those capitalists, Jack Ma, the leader of Alibaba, the Ant Group, these big capital formations, because it is the party that determines the political line. China has capitalists, but it's not a capitalist state. China has capitalists, but they don't form a political class, right? And that's a very, very important thing to bear in mind. The party is pursuing environmental initiatives, the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, we don't have the time to talk about these things in detail. But probably the most important thing about the Communist Party of China today is that it is the unapologetic force leading China down the path towards a socialist future, okay? And that, of course, is what drives Western imperialism, particularly the political leadership in the United States, crazy. They thought that China, that once the party had embraced reform, once the party had decided to employ markets to develop the economy, once the party had opened the door to foreign investment, that it would only be a matter of time before economic liberalism translated into political liberalism, and the party would either change its own color or be overthrown in some sort of color revolution or regime change exercise. That's clearly not going to happen. The Communist Party today is more popular, more widely supported than it has ever been. So that brings us down to this threshold of the anniversary, the centenary of the party. So for those of you who are in the Party for Socialism and Labor, I just wanted to touch at the very last moment here on the question of how should we relate to the Communist Party of China. And I think the key here is to understanding this history, understanding that the Communist Party is not some platonic ideal. It's not some magical force that can snap its fingers and have socialism spring out of the soil. But it is a party that is working along a path which is itself perhaps somewhat of a dangerous path, relying on markets, tolerating the capitalists in the country. These are risky enterprises, but we want to wish them well. We extend critical support. We recognize the achievements that the party has accomplished, and we support the work of building socialism in China. But we also acknowledge that there are problems and challenges. They don't do everything right. They make mistakes. When they make mistakes, it's incumbent upon us to help to point them out and try to encourage them to rectify things. But first and foremost, we defend China against the threat of imperialism. We defend China against the anti-Chinese demonization campaign that is the big bipartisan push in Congress and the White House. The US or Australia or whoever maneuvering in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits. Basically, our position on China is the same as the Chinese position about finding their own way forward, which is to seek truth from facts, not to rely upon the lies of the bourgeois media in the West, not to a capitalist origin, but instead to try to understand the realities of the history of China, the realities of the role of the party within that history, and the realities of what's. How do we want to do that?
Sorry, I just disconnected. What did I miss?
We're at the point where we can do questions.
Okay. Sorry. So yeah, I have the chat set up so that I guess it made Nicholas.
Perhaps if people want to put questions into the chat.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we can do.
A lot of people have become very confused on the question of China, and like every time, in particular, I think every time when it doesn't matter what country it is, whenever the imperialists want to, whenever the ruling class wants to have a new war, they drum up support for every